When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Have you ever noticed how people who do one good deed sometimes feel entitled to slack off afterwards? This is moral licensing, when past good behavior makes us feel like we've earned the right to act badly. Psychologists Benoit Monin and Dale Miller documented how people who demonstrated that they weren't prejudiced in one situation were more likely to discriminate later. We keep unconscious moral balance sheets, and when we're in good credit, we can often give ourselves permission to sin. We rest on our moral laurels. Moral licensing creates confusing contradictions and disagreements. The environmentally conscious citizen who drives a Prius or a Leaf feels justified in taking multiple flights. The generous tipper treats service workers rudely. The volunteer who spent Saturday at the food bank skips their friend's move on Sunday. Past virtue becomes permission for present vice. In relationship conflicts, moral licensing creates maddening dynamics. Your partner does the dishes, then feels entitled to leave clothes everywhere for a week. You plan a thoughtful date night, and then you think you've earned the right to be inattentive for a few days. We can use our good behavior as currency to purchase bad behavior, then get upset when others don't accept the exchange rate. Political discourse reveals moral licensing at a grand scale. Voters support one progressive policy feel licensed to oppose others. We point to our moral credentials while violating the very principles they're supposedly represents. Understanding moral licensing helps explain hypocritical behavior without assuming bad faith. The person isn't necessarily dishonest. They genuinely feel their past good behavior earns them some current leeway. And recognizing this in ourselves prevents moral complacency. Good behavior isn't a bank account we can draw from. Every situation requires some fresh ethical consideration. And in disagreements, moral licensing means past virtue doesn't guarantee present virtue. Judge current actions on their own merits, not on accumulated moral credit. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Lori Britt. Lori is a professor of communication and co-director of the Institute for Constructive Advocacy and Dialogue at James Madison University. She's the author of an upcoming book on facilitative leadership. Lori, tell us an argument story.
Yeah, happy to. This one's over a decade old now, which I can't believe, but it's still one that sticks with me. So the work that I do is bringing people together to have difficult conversations. And I was working with a group in our community. This was pre the decision by the Supreme Court about gay marriage. And the group that had been working in our community was really doing events where they were talking at people, and people were starting to say, we'd like to talk to each other. You know, we don't want to just be talked at. And many of the events were also held in churches, which produces a conflict when you're dealing with issues that involve LGBTQ folks that don't always feel comfortable in a church. And so I was brought onto this committee, and I knew some of the people, and I got to meet some of the people for the first time to put together a different kind of an event where we'd have people talking to each other. But first we were inviting speakers. And that was where the first part of the conflict came up. We invited speakers who were very different people. And I'm just going to call them James and Maggie, just first names. Okay. One represented a queer state advocacy group, and another one represented a national group that was very much for protection of, you know, family as biblically defined, if you'll have it that way. And the first part of the conflict was one of my colleagues who did this work alongside me came running down the hall and me and says, we cannot invite her to our campus. And I felt attacked. And I took a breath and I thought, how am I going to respond to him in a way that's productive? And I said, well, if we can't invite people we disagree with and have these conversations, I have no business doing the work that I do. So that was kind of how it all started, this whole event that we called Marriage and the State.
So just to set the scene here, you're newly on a board that is trying to figure out how we talk about LGBTQ plus issues. Their existing events were very talk at people, not talk with, not deliberate together, trying to make some reforms. In the midst of that, we have this debate, for lack of a better word, that goes off the rails, and then you feel attacked for being responsible for bringing one of the speakers who your colleague disagrees with to campus. Did I get all that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you did. You got that exactly right. So, you know, recognizing that people would be a little hesitant because this speaker did have some things in their past that were, problematic. I said, but we've sat down, we've had dinner, we've talked about the model, we've talked about what we're going to agree to. So and the speakers agreed to a model. I was going to moderate on a stage, and they were going to have to repeat what the other person had shared before they shared their own perspective. We thought that would be a good way of, making sure they're really listening to each other and modeling what can happen when we really listen to people with different opinions.
But what I hear you saying is, and then I repeat back what you just said, if I disagree with you about marriage equality or something along those lines, and then make whatever case I was going to make anyway, most likely. And then you say, and are these events pitched? I mentioned debate earlier, but are they pitched specifically as debates where there is a competitive kind of dialogue and then the audience votes, or how are the events pitched?
Sure. The event was pitched as a community dialogue, but to set the stage and give people enough information, we did the first part of it was me moderating this conversation between these two people on the stage, after which we moved into a cafeteria and everyone sat at small tables and talked with their fellow community members about the issue. So the first part was really just the priming part. But we ran into some other trouble there because exactly you said, where they said, I have to repeat what you just said. The media showed up and these two guest speakers panicked. They're like, they're going to catch a snippet of me repeating what the other person said, and I'm going to lose my job for advocating for something that is not what I believe in.
Yeah, taken out of context, that would be a disaster.
Exactly. So luckily we live in a small enough town and I have background in the media, and I was able to tell the media folks, happy for you to tape the audience and get some B-roll while it's going on. And then I will set you in a room with the two speakers where you can have an interview with them afterwards. And they agreed to that. So luckily that worked out great. But that was another conflict.
There's so many conflicts about you setting up, hopefully, a productive conflict.
Yeah. And a third part of the conflict was the planning group we were working with was very intergenerational. We were across multiple campuses here in our community. We had community members, professors, students, and there was a lot of conflict about whether or not we would require people to use people's pronouns and put them on the name tags.
Okay.
There was a lot of conflict about that. And the great thing was we modeled as a team, kind of really thinking through the pros and cons of that. I believe in valuing people's pronouns that they asked me to use. However, we also knew this was a relatively short event, and there would be a lot. We live in a community with a lot of elderly Mennonite folks who would be at this event, who this would be new for them because it was 2014. We really weren't where we are with pronouns back then. And so this was kind of new and confusing for them. So instead, we came to a great compromise. We said, let's model and ask people to only use names, no pronouns whatsoever. So that's what we did. And it worked fine. And I think everybody felt valued and included, but we also didn't have to spend all this time educating and maybe even setting up walls for people like, oh, I'm not going to engage in this conversation because I don't want to open my mouth and use the wrong pronoun. So that was kind of a way that we got around that part of the conflict.
Lots of conflicts for this event. How did the event go?
The event went great. It beyond great. So after the on-stage modeling, I had a great conversation with these two folks. They were very vulnerable. We moved into the cafeteria. Our committee had baked homemade bread and we had cider. It was fall, so we were trying to set the stage for real community building. And the speakers came in and they said, well, what do you want us to do? I assume you don't want us to join any of these tables. I said, no. I said, our committee is over here. You can join a circle with us and we'll continue the conversation. And they said to us, would you mind if the two of us go over here to a table by ourselves and just keep continuing talking? And my eyes got wide as saucers. I'm like, we did it. And so in full view of everyone else having conversations at their tables, they were seeing these two speakers who, when you first came to the event, you assumed these people have nothing in common, sit there for another hour and talk very wonderfully with each other. I mean, we just couldn't have asked for a better outcome than that.
I feel like I know from this example, this inspiring example, what some of the answer to this question is, but I'm going to ask it anyway to give you the chance. What do the best community events about controversial issues for you look like? Both in terms of, let's start with design. How are the best community controversial events designed? And then we'll move to how do we measure success and effectiveness? In other words, how do we know if it worked?
Sure. I think the first thing about design is the framing it. I always frame events around a question because it lets people know you're coming to an event where you're going to be part of answering that question together with other people. You're not going to be talked at. This is something. So I think our question for that one was, what should be the role of the state in defining marriage?
Yeah.
So
how should government be involved in marriage?
Yeah.
Or should government be involved in marriage?
Right, exactly. What should be the role, if any, of the government in defining marriage? So I think that's where the design starts. Having good questions and recognizing what baggage people may come in with or what might prevent people from bringing their whole self to a discussion and feeling capable of being vulnerable and listening to others. And it's in the way that you write the questions. Questions have to come from a place of curiosity. They cannot come from a place of attack or shame. I think one other thing I would say is you have to make sure people have enough information, factual information. Facts get us part of the way there when we're talking about conflict, but we also use our own values. And so we have to have the facts, but the talk is really about the values once the facts are kind of established.
How do you establish facts about a controversy about which people would disagree over what's true and what's false?
It's getting harder. I will say that's getting much harder, but I don't think we ever I think we present a set of facts that are all true and that we can't ignore parts of it. So we don't ever try and make it a very narrow, small box. But there are a lot of things that are true that people are feeling. And facts are how people are responding, how people are feeling. So it's not always just a fact about a number or a statistic or a policy. So
meaning you are going to host an event about a controversial issue, again, using the marriage equality example, but there are many others we could use. And then you as a moderator would have two people representing different opinions on stage, at least at the beginning, before it devolved into more communal and participatory discussions. And then you would stipulate, okay, marriage equality is really controversial. We know the following X, Y, and Z things to be true, put those up on a board, and then introduce the discussion. Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes we do it that way. Absolutely. Sometimes we don't need to do quite that much work with facts, but in something like this, I think we kind of drew out the parameters and we said, here was the fact. We said, the main fact of this is the Supreme Court is soon going to decide this issue. That's a fact. Second fact is we're all going to continue to live in the same community and be neighbors. What do we want to do with that? Regardless of how they decide, how do we want to go forward continuing to be community members and neighbors? Yeah. So those are facts. We're still going to all live in the same community and the Supreme Court's going to make this decision.
What's the best case scenario from that event for you? In other words, if the event works, what has it worked to do?
People have recognized the people across the table from them as humans, as not people with a totally different set of values than them, but having some shared values that we all value living in a great community. We want to continue to make it a great community. So I think it's the humanization that happens. We stop seeing people as an example of a viewpoint, and we see them as a nuanced, fully human other. If I could give it a quick example, please. One of the most amazing things that happened at one of the small table discussions was there was a young Mennonite couple who were engaged. And, very traditional Mennonite, had the plain garb on and everything. And they were sitting with some queer folks at the tables, some elderly folks, and this young couple that many people might say, oh, Mennonites, very conservative. They're not going to believe in all this. In front of everybody, they said, we believe in marriage. We think marriage is something that God blesses. But we do not feel comfortable getting married until everybody on this planet has the right to get married. So we are not going to get married until queer people have the right to marry. Wow. And I think jaws dropped. People didn't realize that they had allies in the community for their beliefs. I think the other big thing, and you mentioned what do I consider a success, when people walk out having enlarged their thinking. I can see somebody else's perspective on this issue. I may not agree with it, but I can see how it fits their set of beliefs and their
Mm-hmm.
life. And I think we learn a lot about each other when we can open up to the fact that everybody doesn't have to think the same way.
We live in obviously such a polarized climate, but a time of rising distrust and suspicion across the aisle and across different demographics and belief systems. You have this real abiding faith, not just as a writer or a scholar teacher, but as a practitioner of the collective wisdom of getting more people talking about more controversial stuff. In other words, your whole professional life seems to be dedicated to helping people have better conversations about thorny public issues, if I could put that as a bumper sticker. Talk about
That's a great bumper sticker.
Thanks. It's my next career. Talk a bit about your faith in that.
That's a great. I am. I consider myself a pragmatist with a little touch of idealism, because I do think at our core we are human beings who want to connect with other people. Maybe this comes from my own background. I grew up in a family that was very politically engaged, and I grew in my political leanings very differently from what I started at. And so my parents and I have very different perspectives. And for a long time, it was really difficult for me to talk politics with my family at home. And I finally realized that's really hurting us, because I can't find anything out more about my parents unless I'm willing to be curious and ask about their issues. And so I always tell students that I happen to work with, the toughest place you'll ever put this into practice is probably in your own family, because that's where, the stakes are pretty high. You're going to have these people in your life for the rest of your life. So it's a great place to start and to practice.
These kinds of collisions were vehicles for you to express and satisfy curiosity about your parents, about your folks.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, especially my dad, he's much more politically active than my mom. And I don't agree with a lot, but we've finally gotten to the place where we can ask each other questions rather than me feeling like he is giving me a diatribe on why this is the way things should be in the world. We've finally gotten to the place where we can ask each other questions. And I've found out some really interesting things about why he believes what he believes and how his particular life circumstances has led to that. And it makes perfect rational sense to me now. I don't see him as irrational. I see him as, I get that if you went through this set of circumstances, this is what you might believe. But then I gently try and encourage him to think beyond those limits. And I encourage him to make me think beyond my limits as well.
When I hear people who have similarly inspiring stories, I also want to ask about limits to your humility, limits to your curiosity, and limits to your idealism. Are there speakers that you would not, you don't have to name names, but maybe positions or a style of speaking, if they're bombastic or inflammatory? Are there speakers for whom you think giving a platform on a college campus is a bad idea?
Oh, that's tricky. I think the answer is yes, and I think the types of speakers that I am least interested in hearing are those who come at you with such certitude as if they have figured everything else out. Guess what? None of us has it all figured out. We need each other to figure out this complex world that we live in. I think the other thing, my bright line is I will never invite a speaker who, I don't mind if you have a different perspective than me, but you cannot deny somebody's humanity. And that's where my bright line is. I cannot abide dealing with somebody who says you don't even have the right to exist because you are Black, brown, gay, queer, immigrant. I'm sorry, you don't have the right to say that. None of us has the right to say you do or do not have a right to be human. We all have that innate right. And so I have a really hard time. I mean, yes, we can still talk about immigration. It's a really vexing problem. But we can talk about it in ways that do not dismiss the humanity of the people who are coming to our country for various and sundry different reasons. So
in some ways, the platforming of speakers, at least per your metric, are speakers who are already demonstrating some of the values that you're encouraging through these events, which is to have some humility about what you can and can't know, and to have some curiosity about those you're talking to.
Yep. So that's the people that I'd like to have in the room. And we try very hard when we're inviting people to tell them this is going to be a different kind of space. This is what we're asking. This is what we expect. Because we never want to host an event where people come in thinking, oh, this is where I can bring in my 10 talking points and make my case. I want them to come in knowing what kind of a conversation this is going to be. I think that makes it more productive for us all. And it allows us to really lean into the conflict rather than being afraid of it.
The last question is kind of a longitudinal question. We began the show talking about an event in 2014, if I recall, before the Obergefell decision. And the world's obviously a little bit of a different place 11 years into this work, and you've been doing this work before that as well. What are some differences in the ways that you approach, or what are some similarities in the way that you approach the 2025 climate than you might have the 2014 climate?
I think the hardest thing with the current climate is because of the national narratives that exist about how polarized we are, we can't seem to get a good mixed group of people in the room. There are certain people who just do not want to come to a space and be vulnerable. They only want to go to a space where they can be the loudest voice in the room. And that makes me sad. And I don't necessarily blame the people for that. I blame the fact that we are constantly, we need a both end narrative. Yes, we are polarized, but we also crave human connection, and we do better thinking when we do it together. Granted, there are things out there I think experts need to make decisions about. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we have to dialogue about every issue in the world. That's not possible. But for the ones that impact us as humans, as neighbors, as people who share a community, I think we need to have all the voices in the room, and it's just getting harder to do that. Well, it makes me sad, but we're going to find a way.
Lori Britt, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Delighted to be here. Thank you, Michael.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.